Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds like a game show and is quietly a national tragedy wearing a party hat, ranking America's most drug-addicted states, from the merely medicated all the way up to the reigning, undisputed, please don't put this on a postcard champion. It's a countdown nobody wants to win, and every state secretly suspects it's losing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to whoever dropped this topic into the comments. You'd be amazed how often the best episodes come straight from you, and this little channel only grows because people keep handing me ideas I'd never have stumbled onto alone. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's awake at this hour. And if you'd rather rest your eyes entirely, the channel is now on Spotify as well. The link's in the description, same soothing nonsense, none of the screen glow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we start, let yourself wonder a few things. Ever notice how there seem to be more pharmacies than grocery stores, and somehow both are always open? Ever wonder why every single state is quietly convinced the real problem is the state next door? How do you even measure something as private as addiction? Does someone knock on your door and simply ask, and does anyone ever say yes? Why does the map of who's suffering keep rearranging itself while nobody's watching? And here's the strange one. How could the place at the very top of this list be somewhere you would never, in 100 guesses, put your money? Hold on to that thought, because tonight there's no waking up in some distant century. Instead, congratulations. You've just been handed a clipboard, a rental car with brakes that feel more like a polite suggestion, and an assignment nobody volunteers for, to drive the long, quiet back roads of America and count state by state all the ways a tired country tries to feel a little better. Buckle up. It's a longer trip than anyone likes to admit. Before we rank a single state, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Nobody actually knows how many addicts America has. Not really. There's no national head count, no annual census where a clipboard-wielding stranger asks the whole country to raise its hand. Instead, we have two blunt instruments. The first is a giant survey where researchers phone up roughly 70,000 people and gently ask whether they've been misusing anything lately. A method that assumes the deeply addicted are both reachable and honest, which is a bold pair of assumptions. The second instrument is grimmer and far more reliable. We count the dead. Let's sit with that first instrument for a moment, because it's stranger than it sounds. Imagine the scene. Somewhere in America a phone rings or a knock lands on a screen door and a polite person with a tablet asks whether you'd mind answering some questions about your private habits for science. Now imagine you are genuinely in trouble, the kind of trouble that has cost you a job and a marriage and the trust of everyone who used to love you. Are you answering that door? Are you saying yes to the tablet? Of course not. The people furthest into the woods are precisely the people the survey can't find, because they don't have a stable address or a working phone or any earthly reason to confess to a stranger. So the survey, for all its careful math, is a bit like measuring the ocean with a teaspoon and a great deal of confidence. The second instrument doesn't have that problem because death certificates don't decline the interview. They don't say they only did it once at a party. They don't worry about what the neighbours will think. When a coroner signs the paperwork, the number goes into a database in a cold government building, and that number is about as honest as America ever gets about this. Which is why nearly every dramatic ranking you've ever seen is secretly a body count wearing a nicer outfit. When someone confidently tells you which state is the most addicted, what they almost always mean is which state is burying the most people for its size. And that quiet substitution matters more than you'd think. It's the difference between measuring how many people are struggling tonight and measuring how many have already lost. A state could be full of people quietly wrestling with dependence, holding down jobs, hiding it well, dying slowly of nothing the certificate will name, and it might look downright healthy on our chart. Meanwhile, a state where the struggle turns fatal fast will blaze at the top of the list. The suffering isn't necessarily worse in the second place, it's just louder and easier to tally. There's a further wrinkle, because there always is. The way a death gets classified depends on the coroner, the toxicology budget, the local paperwork culture, and whether anyone bothered to test for the newest chemical nobody's heard of yet. 2 identical deaths in 2 different counties can end up counted 2 different ways, purely because one office had the funding to look closely and the other did not. So even our honest instrument, the dead reliable one, has a slightly shaky hand. None of this means the rankings are worthless. It means they're a flashlight, not a floodlight. They show you the shape of the thing without ever quite showing you the whole thing, and the parts that stay dark are exactly the parts that don't photograph well. So keep this close as we drive. Every number tonight is real, and every number tonight is also a shadow of something larger it couldn't quite catch. We're about to rank a country by its grief, using tools that were never built to measure grief at all, which is, when you think about it, a very American way to begin. Now imagine 2 maps of America laid side by side, both claiming to show the same thing, both completely contradicting each other. On the first map, the states glow brightest wherever the raw body count is highest, and the biggest, most crowded state wins by a mile. California loses more people to overdose than any other state, something like 10,000 souls in a single year, a number that sounds apocalyptic until you remember California contains nearly 40 million people. On the second map, everything reshuffles. This one measures deaths per 100,000 residents, and suddenly, the giant coastal states fade to a modest orange while small, rural, mountainous places flare a violent red. Picture the 2 of them taped to a wall, because the disagreement is genuinely a little uncanny. On the raw numbers map, your eye goes straight to the fat, populous giants, the California, the Florida, the big sprawling states where simply having more people means having more of everything, including more funerals. It's the map that makes the evening news, because 10,000 is a number that lands like a fist. On the per capita map, those same giants shrink politely into the background, and your eye is yanked instead toward places you might struggle to find without squinting. Thin ribbons of red draped across the mountains and the far north, states losing their people 3 or 4 times faster for their size. Here's the thing about that second map, and why it matters so much tonight. Raw numbers reward bigness, and bigness isn't a moral failing. A state isn't more addicted just because more people happen to live there, any more than a stadium is sicker than a living room because more people cough in it. If we ranked by raw deaths, we'd essentially just be ranking states by population, dressed up as something more meaningful. It would be like declaring the ocean the wettest thing on Earth, technically flawless, completely useless. So the per capita map is the honest one, the one that asks a fairer question. Not how many did you lose, but how fast are you losing them relative to how many you had? And the moment you ask it that way, the whole story inverts. The famous states go quiet. The overlooked ones start screaming. A place with a fraction of California's population can sit at the very top of the leaderboard while barely registering on the raw chart, because the rate is what strips away the accident of size and shows you where the fire is actually hottest. It's a little like comparing 2 households. One family loses a shocking amount of money each month, but they're wildly rich, so it barely dents them. Another family loses far less in dollars, but it's most of what they had. Only a fool would call the first family worse off just because the number is bigger. The rate tells you who's actually drowning. The raw total just tells you who has the biggest bathtub. And yet, and this is important, both maps are true at once. California really does bury the most people. West Virginia really does lose them fastest. Neither map is lying. They're answering different questions, and the confusion comes entirely from people who quote one number while pretending it settles the other. You'll meet those people online tonight if you scroll long enough, each one absolutely certain, each one holding exactly half the truth like it's the whole thing. Tonight we're using the second map, the per capita one, because a ranking that just rewards being populous isn't a ranking, it's a census with a grim hat on. So when we start climbing this list and you find yourself thinking, but surely the big famous state should be higher, remember the two maps on the wall, quietly refusing to shake hands. We pick the one that measures the burning, not the bigness. Keep it in mind, because everything from here on depends on it. Here's a plot twist you weren't expecting from a video with this title. The numbers are falling. Falling fast, actually. At the peak, around 2022 and 2023, America was losing well over 100,000 people a year to overdose, an entire mid-sized city vanishing every 12 months. Then something shifted. By 2024, the toll dropped to roughly 80,000, and by 2025 it slid closer to 70,000, the steepest decline anyone had ever recorded. Fentanyl deaths in particular collapsed by more than a third. Let that size settle in for a second, because in the fog of a crisis it's easy to lose the scale of it. A drop from 110,000 to 70,000 is not a rounding error. It is tens of thousands of people who were statistically slated to die and who did not. It is roughly the population of a decent-sized town still walking around, going to work, arguing about the thermostat, entirely unaware they were on a list they never got removed from in any dramatic way. They simply weren't crossed off. That is arguably the single largest piece of good news in American public health this decade. And here is the genuinely strange part. Nobody threw a parade. There were no fireworks, no president cutting a ribbon in front of a big descending chart, no montage on the nightly news with swelling music. A crisis that had dominated headlines for years began quietly reversing, and the coverage of the reversal was a fraction of the coverage of the collapse. It turns out despair is far more televisual than recovery. A rising death toll is a story. A falling one is a footnote. We are, as a species, much better at watching the building burn than at noticing the smoke thinning out. So why did it happen? The honest answer is that experts are still arguing, and anyone who gives you a single tidy cause is selling something. Part of it is the overdose reversal spray, once rare and now stuffed into gas station shelves and glove compartments, and the backpacks of people who never used to carry such things, snatching people back from the edge in real time. Part of it is a slow, grinding expansion of treatment, more access, fewer walls between a desperate person and a door that opens. Part of it, more darkly, is that a supply this lethal eventually runs low on the most vulnerable people to take. A grim thinning that no one wants to say out loud but that the mathematicians whisper about. And part of it is simply that the street chemistry keeps changing, sometimes in ways that happen, for now, to kill slightly fewer. What matters for our countdown is what this decline does to the map. It means the paint is still wet. Every ranking tonight is a photograph of a thing that will not hold still, a long exposure shot of a runner mid-stride. The states that led the list for a decade are, some of them, falling faster than anyone predicted. States that looked safe are, a few of them, creeping upward against the tide. The leaderboard you'd have drawn 5 years ago is already wrong, and the one we draw tonight will be a little wrong by the time the next full year of data staggers in. There's a strange comfort in that, if you let there be. It means this is not fixed. It means a place at the top of this grim chart is not condemned to stay there forever. that the worst year is not automatically the destiny. Numbers that climbed can descend. They just did dramatically, while barely anyone applauded. So as we begin the countdown proper, carry this quietly with you. The story you're about to hear is real, but it is not finished, and lately, against every expectation, it has been bending toward mercy. Let's set the ground rules before anyone accuses us of cheating, which is the second favourite pastime of the internet after cheating. We're ranking by overdose death rate per 100,000 residents, the cleanest state level number we've got, and we're leaning on the most recent full year available, with a nervous glance at the provisional numbers trickling in behind it. But here's the honest catch, and I want you awake for this one. The exact order wobbles. Understand why it wobbles, because it's not carelessness. It's mathematics being honest for once. When you're dealing with the bigger states, the numbers are so large that they're stable, the way the tide is stable, moving but predictable. But most states aren't that big, and once you get into the smaller ones, the per capita rate starts behaving like a nervous animal. A single unusually bad winter, one tainted batch moving through one region, a spell of especially cold nights that keeps people isolated indoors, and a state's rate can jump or dip enough to shuffle 3 or 4 places on the board. You're not watching a fixed hierarchy. You're watching a slow, restless reshuffling, and anyone who presents you a crisp, permanent 1 through 50 list is quietly ironing over that restlessness, to look more authoritative than the data actually allows. So think of tonight less as a rigid leaderboard carved in granite, and more as a set of tiers, neighbourhoods of severity rather than street addresses. The bottom tier, the low-rate states, they're solidly at the bottom, and they've been there a while. The top tier, the handful of places that keep appearing near the summit year after year, that's real and durable and not a fluke. It's the middle where the seating chart turns to jelly, where a state at, say, the 20th spot could just as fairly be at the 24th, depending on which month you froze the picture. We'll move through those middle tiers by region and by theme, rather than pretending to know their precise rank to the decimal, because pretending would be a lie dressed as precision. A second rule, and it's a big one, we are ranking overdose deaths, which means we're quietly, unavoidably ranking mostly one family of drugs, the opioids, and lately one drug above all. That's because those kill quickly and get counted cleanly. It leaves whole other worlds of addiction barely represented, the slow burn of the bottle, the grinding wakefulness of the stimulant, the quiet dependence hiding inside a legitimate prescription bottle. So when we crown a most addicted state tonight, hear the asterisk in it. We're crowning the state where addiction most reliably turns fatal fastest, which is related to, but not identical to, where the most people are quietly unwell. A third rule, offered gently. We are not going to treat any of these states as a joke or a stereotype, and we're not going to treat the people inside the numbers as a punchline. The comedy tonight, such as it is, lives in the absurdity of the systems, the policies that made things worse, the data that can't quite see straight, the way a country studies its own wound with a ruler that keeps bending. The people are not the absurd part. The people are the part we're being careful with. And one final rule, mostly for your comfort. You do not need to memorize any of this. There's no quiz. If you drift off somewhere around the middle tiers, you have my blessing. That's rather the point of the whole channel. The numbers will still be here in the morning, doing their slow, restless dance whether or not you're awake to watch. So settle in. The rules are set, the tiers are drawn, the rental car is idling. Let's start, as all honest countdowns should, at the very bottom, where America is doing suspiciously well. Every countdown has a vast mumbling middle, and this one is no exception. Somewhere between the states that barely register and the states that make the news, there's a wide grey band of the merely average. Places doing neither well nor catastrophically, just quietly absorbing their share of the damage. These are the states that never trend, never get a documentary crew, never become shorthand for the whole crisis. And that anonymity is its own quiet lie. Think about what average actually means here, because the word is doing some very heavy, very dishonest lifting. In almost any other context, average is reassuring. Average blood pressure, average rainfall, average commute, these are words that let you exhale. But an average overdose rate in America right now still means a state losing its people at a pace that would have looked like a screaming emergency a generation ago. The baseline has crept so high that ordinary is horrifying by the old measure. We've simply gotten used to it. The way you stop hearing a highway after you've lived beside it long enough. The middle of this list is where the crisis learned to sound like traffic. These middle states share a certain texture. They usually have a couple of mid-sized cities carrying most of the weight, a scattering of struggling smaller towns, and a great deal of ordinary in between, suburbs and strip malls and school pickup lines where the whole thing is happening quietly behind closed garage doors. There's no single dramatic epicenter to point a camera at, no neighborhood whose name becomes a synonym for the problem. It's diffuse, spread thin, which paradoxically makes it easier to ignore. A concentrated tragedy demands attention. A tragedy smeared evenly across a whole state just becomes the weather. And so these places develop a strange relationship with their own suffering. Ask people who live there and many will tell you, with total sincerity, that the problem is mostly somewhere else, the next state over, the bad part of the nearest city, some other kind of family than theirs. It's not denial exactly. It's more that when the damage is evenly distributed, no single person sees enough of it in one place to grasp the size of the whole. Everyone glimpses their own small corner of it. A cousin, a former co-worker, the kid who used to mow the lawn, and files it as a private misfortune rather than a piece of a pattern. The middle is where the epidemic becomes 1,000 separate sad stories that nobody quite stacks on top of each other. There's a particular kind of person who holds these middle states together, and they almost never get mentioned. The pharmacist who has learned every regular's name and their refill schedule and the exact look on a face that means something has gone wrong. The emergency room nurse on the overnight shift who can predict the busy nights by the weather and the calendar. The school counsellor who has quietly become an expert in a subject they never trained for. In the top-tier states, these people are visibly overwhelmed. At least the cameras find them. In the middle, they just carry it, unwatched, one shift at a time, absorbing a slow, steady toll that never rises high enough to make anyone outside the building care. We'll pass through this grey band quickly tonight, the way you pass 100 exits on a night drive without reading a single sign. Headlights sweeping over names you'll never remember. But don't mistake forgettable for painless. The states in the middle aren't spared. They're just quiet, and quiet is a very different thing from safe. If anything, the middle is where the crisis is most fully woven into normal life. So ordinary it's invisible, so distributed it can't be filmed. Nobody in the middle feels average about it. They just live it one funeral at a time, in a state that never made the list you clicked on. Now onward to the far better end. Let's start at the bottom, which is to say the top, which is to say the good end, where the states are doing so relatively well that it almost feels like cheating. Down here you'll find the quiet agricultural strongholds, the flat, wind-scoured places where the overdose death rate can dip below 4 per 100,000, while the hardest hit states are pushing 10 times that. Nebraska sits near the very floor. Its neighbours on the plains keep it company. And before anyone credits superior virtue, understand this is mostly geography and luck rather than moral fibre. Picture the landscape for a moment, because the landscape is most of the explanation. Endless flat horizon. Farm roads running arrow straight to a vanishing point. Towns spaced far apart like buttons on a very long coat. and a sky that takes up most of the view. It's beautiful in a stark, unbothered way, and it is also crucially a pain in the neck to distribute anything to. The modern drug supply moves like any other product, along corridors, through hubs, following highways and cities and density the way water follows the slope of the land. A region with few big cities, few major trafficking arteries, and a whole lot of empty in between is simply a bad delivery route. For a long stretch of this crisis, the poison arrived here late, thin and expensive, and that lateness bought these states years. There's a temptation always to look at a low number and reach for a flattering story. Good values, strong families, hard work and clean living. And sure, none of that hurts, but it would be a mistake, and a slightly insulting one to everybody else, to pretend the folks in the hardest hit states just wanted it less. The planes didn't out-discipline the crisis, they out-inconvenienced it. Being difficult to reach turned out to be one of the great underrated public health interventions of the age, and it required no funding, no policy, and no willpower whatsoever. Just a lot of open space and a shortage of interstates. It's the geographic equivalent of surviving a flood because your house happened to sit on a hill. You can even watch the protection wearing thin in real time, which is the unsettling part. The empty spaces are not as empty as they used to be. The supply that once couldn't be bothered to make the trip has, in recent years, started making the trip, because a market that saturated the cities eventually goes looking for the countryside. So some of these low-ranked states have begun to see their gentle numbers stir upward, not into catastrophe, not yet, but enough to notice, enough to end the comfortable assumption that distance would protect them forever. The hill, it turns out, is not as tall as it looked, and the water is still rising. It's worth sitting with the contrast, though, because it's genuinely stark and genuinely instructive. Two states in the same country, under the same federal laws, with access to the same medicines and the same warnings, and one is losing its people 10 times faster than the other. That gap has almost nothing to do with the character of the residents, and almost everything to do with accidents of place, economy, and supply. It's a powerful argument against the oldest and cruelest idea in this whole story, the idea that addiction is a personal weakness rather than a condition shaped by where you happen to stand when the tide comes in. So we'll tip our hat to the low end, to Nebraska and its wide, wind-blown neighbours sitting near the floor of a list nobody wants to top. They earn their spot mostly by being far away from the worst of it, protected by prairie and distance, and the plain, bad economics of delivering death to the middle of nowhere. It's a fragile blessing, and a fading one. But for now, at the good end of the map, being hard to reach was the best medicine going, and half the states in America would have taken it in a heartbeat. But look closer at those low-ranked plain states and you notice something odd. The opioid numbers are gentle, yes, but a different shadow stretches across the region entirely. Methamphetamine. The story America tells itself is a fentanyl story, an opioid story, a needle and nod story. Across huge stretches of the rural middle and mountain west, though, the real workhorse has long been the stimulant, the drug that keeps a person awake for 3 days and hollows them out slowly rather than dropping them all at once. Here's the crucial mechanical difference, and it's the whole reason these states can look so healthy on our particular map. An opioid overdose is fast and unambiguous, the breathing slows, then stops, and there's a body and a certificate and a number that flow straight into the database we've been leaning on all night. Meth doesn't work that way. It rarely kills in a single dramatic event. Instead, it wears a person down over months and years, straining the heart, frying the sleep, unspooling the mind. doing its damage on a timeline too slow and too diffuse to produce a clean overdose statistic. So a region can be genuinely saturated with stimulant addiction and still post a modest overdose death rate, because meth prefers the long game and our ruler is built to measure the short one. Think of it as two different kinds of predator. The opioid is the ambush, sudden and final, the thing that takes you in one night. The stimulant is the drought, slow and grinding, the thing that takes your job and your teeth and your relationships and your grip on reality 1 week at a time, until there's very little left to take. Both are devastating. Only one of them reliably ends in the kind of event a coroner tallies. And so our map, honest as it tries to be, has a blind spot roughly the size of the Great Plains, a whole region living through a crisis the chart can barely see. The geography of meth is its own strange story. Where the opioid crisis followed the old industrial corridors and the pill mill highways, the stimulant put down roots in the rural west and the wide open middle, in places with space to cook it out of sight and distance enough to move it quietly. It became, in some towns, less a shocking outbreak than a background condition, woven into the economy of decline, filling the same hole that the vanished factory or the failing farm left behind. It offered energy to people who were exhausted in every sense, a chemical answer to the specific despair of a place that felt like it was being slowly emptied out. And it makes a quiet mockery of the whole idea of ranking states by a single number. If you redrew the map to weigh stimulant harm properly, to count the slow devastations alongside the sudden ones, some of tonight's low-ranked heroes would darken considerably. The state that looks almost untouched by our overdose measure might, by a fuller accounting of human wreckage, sit far higher than its gentle rate suggests. We're not redrawing the map tonight, because the clean numbers don't exist to do it with, but you should know the low ranks are partly an illusion produced by the specific thing we chose to count. So the plains keep their spot near the bottom of our list, technically and legitimately, while quietly carrying a burden our list was never designed to register. It's a useful humility to hold as we climb toward the loud, fast, fatal top of the board. The states up there are dying visibly, and that visibility is exactly why they rank. The states down here are, in their own slower way, also hurting, just off camera, in a manner the statistics politely decline to notice. The overdose map shows you where death comes quickly. It stays quiet about where it merely comes slowly. Meth lives in that silence, and so do a great many people the chart forgot. Now the road starts to tilt upward, and the desert states are the ones climbing. While most of the country celebrated its historic decline, a handful of places in the sun-baked southwest went stubbornly the other way. Arizona, Colorado, Nevada. These are the states that posted increases while their neighbours exhaled, rising by 10% or more in a single year against the national tide. Part of it is simple plumbing. They sit astride the newest, fastest supply routes, the corridors where the strongest street product arrives first and freshest. To understand why the Sunbelt is climbing while the old strongholds fall, picture the supplier's weather, a front moving across the map over years. It hit the eastern industrial regions first, back when pills led the way, then rolled through the mountains and the northeast, and only more recently pressed hard into the southwest, along the routes that carry so much of everything else into the country. So the desert states are, in a grim sense, simply newer to the deadliest phase of this. The front arrived late, and it's still building here while it's finally breaking apart back east. Their rising numbers aren't a failure of character, they're a matter of timing and geography, the same forces that protected the plains, only pointed the opposite direction. But there's more to it than plumbing, and this is where the Sunbelt's particular story gets sad. These are the boomtown states, the places people move to, the destinations at the end of everyone's fresh start fantasy. Sprawling metros that barely existed a couple of generations ago, swollen now with newcomers chasing warmth and work and the promise of starting over. And a city built almost entirely out of new arrivals is a city with very thin roots. It's full of people far from the family that would notice them slipping, far from the old friends who'd have staged an intervention, adrift in a place that doesn't yet know their name. Transience is lovely on a moving truck and brutal in a crisis. There's a specific loneliness to a brand new sprawl, and it's worth naming because it feeds directly into these numbers. The endless subdivisions, identical and freshly built, the long drives that isolate everyone in their own climate-controlled bubble, the neighbours who moved in last spring and will move out next year. It's a landscape almost engineered against the kind of dense, nosy, interdependent community that catches a struggling person early. You can vanish in a boomtown in a way you can't quite vanish in an old-rooted place where 3 generations know your business. The Sun Belt sold space and privacy and reinvention, and space and privacy and reinvention are, it turns out, also excellent conditions for a private problem to grow unwatched. Add to all this the particular strain of the newest arrivals, the ones who came precisely because something back home had already gone wrong. People move to the desert to escape, and some fraction of what they were escaping travels in the luggage. A fresh start is a wonderful thing to sell and a very hard thing to actually be, because you arrive still carrying yourself. The marketing promised a new person under a big warm sky. The reality was the same person, now also lonely, also far from help, also sitting downstream of the freshest supply in the country. So the Sun Belt climbs, somewhere in the middle to upper stretch of our list and rising, a rare patch of red on a map that's mostly cooling. It's a warning that this crisis isn't a fixed feature of certain doomed regions, but a moving thing that follows people, follows loneliness, follows the newest routes to the newest cities. The places that spent decades advertising themselves as where you go to feel better are quietly posting numbers that ask a harder question about whether feeling better ever actually arrived. Under all that generous sunshine, the answer for a rising number of people has been no. Let's pause the countdown for a confession about what these rankings systematically miss. Every list like this one is really an opioid list wearing a general-purpose title, because opioids, and fentanyl above all, kill quickly and unmistakably, which makes them easy to count. But addiction is a much wider country than that. There's the stimulant belt we already mentioned. There's the vast, socially acceptable ocean of alcohol, which quietly outkills every illegal drug combined and never makes a single one of these dramatic countdowns. Start with that ocean, because its size is genuinely staggering and almost nobody clicks on a video about it. Alcohol is woven so thoroughly into ordinary life that we've stopped seeing it as a drug at all. It's the thing at the wedding, the barbecue, the funeral, the promotion, the breakup, the Tuesday. It's advertised on the stadium wall and stocked at the grocery store between the bread and the birthday cards, and it kills, by most serious accounting, more Americans per year than all the illegal drugs combined, through slow liver failure, through accidents, through the long arithmetic of decades of heavy use. But an alcohol death is usually undramatic and delayed, a cirrhosis diagnosis 30 years in the making, and 30 years does not photograph like a young person gone in a night. So it never makes the countdown. The deadliest drug in the country is the one we don't even file under drugs. Then there's the vast middle ground of prescription misuse, which hides inside the most legitimate packaging imaginable. Not everyone struggling is buying from a stranger in an alley. A great many are simply taking a little more than the bottle says, a little longer than the doctor meant, sliding by degrees from patient to something else, while the child-proof cap and the pharmacy label keep the whole thing looking respectable. That kind of dependence rarely produces a clean overdose statistic, and almost never produces a headline, because it wears a cardigan and pays its taxes. It's addiction in the suburbs, in the retirement community, in the medicine cabinet behind the mirror, and it barely dents our map. And consider the sheer scale of what the surveys do manage to capture. In a recent year, something like 1 in 6 Americans over the age of 12 met the criteria for a substance use disorder in the past year. Tens of millions of people, and only a small fraction of those will ever appear in an overdose statistic. The gap between how many are struggling and how many are dying is enormous, and are ranking lives entirely inside the smaller, deadlier number. We're measuring the tip of an iceberg and confidently describing the shape of the whole thing from the bit poking above the water. There's a reason it shakes out this way, and it isn't a conspiracy, just the gravity of what's countable. Fast deaths generate clean data. Clean data generates rankings. Rankings generate clicks. And so the entire public conversation gets quietly organised around the one slice of addiction that happens to produce tidy numbers, while the slower, wider, less telegenic slices, the bottle, the pill bottle, the long grind of the stimulant fade into a background we've all agreed not to rank. It's not that anyone decided they don't matter, it's that they don't tally. And in a world run on tallies, the untallied become invisible. So take this as a permanent asterisk stapled to everything else tonight. When we crown the most addicted state, we mean the most fatally, quickly, countably addicted by the specific measure that produces numbers at all. The fuller map, the one that would weigh every quiet dependence and every slow decline, doesn't exist, because the data to draw it doesn't exist. Keep one eye on that empty space beside the numbers as we climb. It's where most of the suffering actually lives, unranked, unfilmed, and for the purposes of every list like this one, all but unseen. Push northeast and the air changes. The land gets greyer, the factories older, and the story shifts from geography to history, specifically the history of what happens when the work leaves and never comes back. The industrial Midwest, Ohio chief among it, became one of the earliest and most enduring faces of the crisis for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the drug itself. When a steel town loses its steel, or a factory town its factory, it doesn't just lose paychecks. It loses purpose, structure, the reason to be awake and sober on a Tuesday. You have to picture what these towns were before you can understand what happened when they stopped being it. A single mill or plant would anchor an entire community, 3 shifts a day, the whistle organising everyone's hours, the paycheck reliable enough to buy a house and raise a family, and imagine your kids doing a little better than you did. The work was hard and often dangerous, but it was work, and it came wrapped in an entire identity. You weren't just employed. You were a steel worker, a machinist, part of something with a name and a history and a bar where everyone gathered after the shift. The job wasn't only how you paid the bills, it was who you were. Then, over a couple of decades, much of that machinery went quiet. The plant closed or shrank or moved somewhere the labour was cheaper, and the whistle stopped organising anybody's day. What it left behind wasn't just unemployment, which is bad enough, but a kind of collective bereavement, a whole town grieving a version of itself that wasn't coming back. And grief, unaddressed, goes looking for anything that makes the ache stop for a while. Into exactly that emptiness, at exactly the wrong moment, marched the prescription pill, marketed hard to a population that happened to be full of both genuine physical pain and a deeper pain nobody had a prescription for. That's the part worth being precise about, because the lazy story blames the people, and the true story is more damning. These were regions full of bodies that legitimately hurt, from decades of heavy manual labour, worn joints and ruined backs, and the wear of work that used people up. So the demand for pain relief was real and reasonable. What turned it catastrophic was an industry that saw that real demand and poured fuel on it, promoting powerful opioids with reassurances about safety that later proved to be worth nothing. The Rust Belt didn't go looking for its addiction. It was a vulnerable market, and it was marketed to precisely and relentlessly at its lowest moment. And once the pill seeded a dependence across a whole region, the rest followed the grim logic that runs through this entire story. When the prescriptions eventually got harder to obtain, the need they'd created didn't evaporate. It went shopping, and the street offered cheaper, stronger, deadlier alternatives, first one, then the next, each wave washing over communities already soaked by the last. Ohio and its neighbours spent years near the top of these lists, not because of any single villain, but because they got hit early, hit hard, and then hit again before they could recover from the first blow. The encouraging note, and there is one, is that even here the recent national decline has finally reached the valley towns, the numbers bending downward after a brutally long climb. But the wound underneath is older and deeper than any drug, and it won't close just because one statistic improves. You cannot overdose a region back to prosperity, and nobody ever seriously tried the reverse, which would have meant giving these places their purpose back rather than just their pain pills. The Rust Belt remembers what it used to be. That memory is half the ache, and the crisis found its opening in precisely the gap between who these towns were and who they were left to become. To understand the whole eastern half of this map, you have to understand a single, sunny, unlikely villain: Florida and the pill mills of the early 2000s. For a stretch of years, Florida had almost no system for tracking who was prescribing what, which meant strip mall pain clinics could hand out opioid prescriptions with roughly the oversight of a lemonade stand. People drove for entire days, up a route that earned itself a grim nickname, to fill trunks with pills and carry them back north into Appalachia and the Rust Belt to sell. Let's set the scene, because it's almost cartoonishly brazen in hindsight. Picture a sun-baked plaza somewhere in Florida, the kind with a nail salon, a sandwich shop, and a clinic with the blinds drawn. Inside that clinic, a doctor is seeing patients at a pace no honest physician could manage, writing prescriptions for powerful opioids to a line of people that stretches out the door and into the parking lot, many of whom drove from several states away and are paying cash. There's often an on-site pharmacy, conveniently, so you can fill the script before you've even left the building. It ran less like medicine and more like a drive-through, and for a while, almost nothing in the law stood in its way. The reason it could happen was a plain bureaucratic hole. Most states had begun building databases to flag someone collecting suspicious quantities of controlled prescriptions, a simple check to catch the obvious abuse. Florida, for years, didn't have a working one, which meant a person could visit clinic after clinic in a single day, each doctor blind to the others, and assemble a car trunk's worth of pills that no single prescriber ever saw the full size of. The state became, functionally, the unregulated pharmacy of the entire eastern seaboard, and an entire smuggling economy sprang up to move the product north. That's where the highway comes in, the long interstate run from Florida up into the mountains and the industrial towns travelled so heavily by pill couriers that it picked up a nickname evoking a non-stop express service. The metaphor was apt in the worst way. This wasn't a trickle, it was a pipeline, a reliable high-volume artery carrying prescription opioids from a state with no controls into regions primed by economic collapse to receive them. The demand in the north, which we just talked about, met the supply in the south, and the highway was the vein connecting the two. It's one of the clearest illustrations in the whole crisis of how a single regulatory gap in one state could bleed into the death rates of a dozen others. Eventually, Florida noticed and cracked down. Hard. New laws, a real monitoring database, raids that shuttered the mills in waves, and on paper it worked. The pills dried up, the drive-through clinics went dark, the express highway lost its cargo. But here's the bitter twist that runs through everything tonight. shutting off the supply did nothing to shut off the dependence it had already created. You cannot unaddict several million people by closing the store where they shopped. You just leave them dependent and suddenly cut off, which is not a solution, but a market opportunity. And the market, being a market, responded with brutal efficiency. Into the gap left by the vanished pills rushed heroin, cheaper and stronger, and then, in time, something far deadlier still. The crackdown that everyone celebrated as a victory arguably accelerated the transition to the truly lethal phase of the crisis, because it removed the relatively predictable pill while leaving intact the millions of people who now needed something to replace it. The pill mills closed. The demand they had so profitably manufactured did not. That highway, and the hole in the law that built it, is the foundation half the states higher on this list are unknowingly standing on. Pennsylvania earns its place high on this board, and much of the weight sits in a single Philadelphia neighborhood whose name has become shorthand for the crisis at its most raw. We've spent a whole episode there before, so tonight will be brief and gentle, because the people on that avenue are not a punchline and never were. What matters for the ranking is that Pennsylvania combines everything: an old industrial economy, a major port city, dense population, and an early, brutal introduction to the strongest street supply in the country. Think about how many of tonight's separate threads all knot together in this one state, because that convergence is exactly why it ranks so high. You've got the Rust Belt story, the fading industrial towns spread across the state's interior, full of the same economic grief we walked through a few segments ago. You've got a major East Coast port and a dense urban core sitting right on the corridor that moves so much of the supply up and down the seaboard. You've got old, entrenched patterns of use in some neighborhoods that predate the modern crisis by decades. Pennsylvania isn't high on the list because of one thing. It's high because nearly every force we've discussed runs straight through it at once, meeting in the same place like rivers joining. The avenue itself has become, fairly or not, a kind of national symbol, the place news crews go when they want a single image to stand in for the whole catastrophe. And that's exactly why we'll tread carefully. It's very easy to turn a struggling neighborhood into a horror set, to point a camera at people on the worst day of their lives and call it journalism. But the people there are not scenery. They are somebody's kid, somebody's parent, somebody who at some earlier point had an ordinary life and a set of dreams, and then a series of turns, many of them not remotely their fault, that led to a sidewalk that ends up on the evening news. The dignity there is easy to forget precisely because it's been filmed so often. What makes the avenue genuinely distinct and worth understanding for the ranking is how it concentrates the crisis into a space you can walk across. Most of this epidemic is diffuse, spread thin, hidden behind closed doors, which is part of why it's so easy to ignore. Here it's the opposite, compressed into a few blocks with an intensity that's almost impossible to look away from. That concentration makes it a magnet for both the desperate and the cameras, and it distorts the picture in a strange way, because it lets the rest of the country point at one neighborhood and quietly pretend the problem lives only there, and not also in 10,000 quiet places that never get filmed. Because that's the thing about Pennsylvania that the avenue's fame obscures. The state's high ranking isn't really about a few blocks in one city. It's diffused across the entire map, into small towns and mid-sized cities and rural stretches where the same suffering plays out with no cameras present at all. The famous neighborhood gets the attention and absorbs the whole nation's mental image of the crisis, while an equal or greater weight of it happens in silence everywhere else in the state. The spotlight on the avenue is bright enough to leave everything around it in shadow. There is, mercifully, some genuine good news to report even here. Pennsylvania's numbers have finally begun to turn downward, part of that broad national decline we talked about, the first real easing after years of relentless climb. Nobody living it would yet dare call the shape of things recovery. But the line is bending, even on the famous avenue, even in the quiet towns nobody visits. Pennsylvania sits high on our list tonight, carrying the whole weight of the crisis at once, and for the first time in a long time, carrying just slightly less of it than the year before. Right around Pennsylvania, the drug supply itself did something that scrambled every assumption on this list. It stopped being just fentanyl. A veterinary sedative, xylazine, began appearing in the street supply, mixed in to stretch the product and lengthen the high. The problem is that xylazine isn't an opioid at all, which means the overdose reversal sprays that had started saving so many lives simply don't work on it. Sit with the cruelty of that mechanism for a second, because it's the kind of thing that keeps the people who study this awake at night. Across the country, communities had finally armed themselves with a genuine miracle. A nasal spray that could yank someone back from an opioid overdose in seconds, cheap enough to stock everywhere, simple enough that a frightened bystander could use it. It was arguably the single biggest reason the death number started falling. And then the supply quietly mutated to include something that spray cannot touch. The rescue tool still works on the opioid part. It does nothing for the sedative riding alongside it. The lifeline was met with a knot the lifeline wasn't designed to untie. Xylazine, called Trank on the street, was never meant for people at all. It's a sedative used on large animals, and it found its way into the human supply purely as a business decision, a cheap additive to bulk out the product and make the high last longer, with no regard whatsoever for what it does to a human body. And what it does is genuinely grim, including causing severe wounds that can appear even far from any injection site, wounds that are notoriously difficult to treat and that turned harm reduction workers into wound care specialists overnight, facing injuries their training never covered. But the deeper horror, for our purposes, isn't any single new substance. It's what Trank represents about the whole nature of this crisis. The supply is not a fixed target. It is a moving, mutating thing that responds to pressure the way a liquid responds to a hand pushing on it, simply flowing into a new shape. Every time public health builds an effective defense against one drug, the underlying chemistry shifts into something the defense doesn't cover. Crack down on pills, get heroin, flood the streets with the opioid antidote, get an additive the antidote can't reverse. It's an arms race where one side is a nimble, profit-driven chemistry set, and the other is a slow-moving public health system perpetually fighting the last war. This is why every ranking tonight, including this one, carries a hidden expiration date. Our numbers assume the enemy holds still long enough to be measured, counted, mapped, and ranked. It never has. By the time a death rate is finalized and published and turned into a chart in a video like this one, the thing that rate measured has often already changed into something slightly new, slightly harder to reverse, slightly harder to survive. We are always describing yesterday's supply with yesterday's tools, and the supply has already moved on to tomorrow. There's a strange, dark ingenuity to it that's worth acknowledging, because underestimating the adaptability of this thing is exactly how communities keep getting caught flat-footed. Nobody in a lab coat designed Trank as a weapon. It emerged from the plain economics of the street, a cheaper way to stretch a product, indifferent to the wounds and the sedation and the antidote it happened to defeat. The market discovered it the way a river discovers a crack in a dam, not through malice, just through relentless pressure finding the weak point. So Pennsylvania and its neighbours sit high on our list, partly because they were the leading edge of this rewrite, the first places to face a supply that had quietly evolved past the rescue tools everyone was counting on. The Trank era is a reminder to hold every number loosely. We rank a moving target, with a ruler built for a stationary one, in a race where the finish line keeps relocating. The best we can honestly say is that the map was accurate at the moment we froze it, and that the ground beneath it has almost certainly already shifted. Maryland lands in the upper reaches of this list on the strength of one of the oldest addiction stories in the country, and it predates fentanyl by decades. Long before the pills, before the modern crisis had a name, Baltimore carried one of the deepest and most entrenched heroin cultures in America, a multi-generational presence woven so thoroughly into certain neighborhoods that it became almost infrastructural. To grasp Maryland, you have to understand that not every high-ranking state got there recently. Some places didn't catch this crisis in the 2000s, like a new flu going around. They'd been living with a version of it since long before most of the country was paying attention, back when heroin was the drug in question and the geography of it was concentrated in specific cities with specific histories. Baltimore is the clearest example, a place where the drug economy became so established, so many decades deep, that it stopped feeling like a crisis arriving and started feeling like a permanent feature of the landscape, as fixed as the row houses and the harbour. When something is that entrenched, it changes in kind, not just degree. A brand new outbreak has edges, a before and an after, a clear line where ordinary life ended and the trouble began. A crisis 50 years deep has no such edges. It becomes environmental, part of the water, something a young person doesn't so much encounter as inherit. In the hardest hit neighborhoods, a kid doesn't discover the drug the way a suburban teenager might stumble onto something new and shocking. They grow up inside a landscape where it was already present in the previous generation, and the one before that, as ambient and unremarkable as the weather. Discovery implies novelty. This was inheritance. That long history matters enormously for how the modern wave landed here. When fentanyl swept in, it didn't create Maryland's problem out of nothing the way it did in some fresh-hit places. It arrived in a state that already had a large established population of people using an existing infrastructure of supply and demand built up over generations. Fentanyl didn't light the fire. It poured accelerant on one that had been burning steadily since the middle of the last century. The result was a death rate that shot up not because the problem was new, but because a decades-old problem suddenly got vastly more lethal overnight. This is a pattern you'll notice repeating as we climb the list, and it's worth naming plainly. The states near the very top are rarely the ones where addiction just showed up. They're overwhelmingly the ones where it's ancestral, handed down, baked into the history of particular communities long before the current chemistry made it so deadly. The newest, fastest drug did its worst damage in exactly the places least equipped to resist it. The places where the roots ran deepest, and the ground was already saturated. Maryland's high ranking is a monument to how long this has actually been going on in some corners of America, before the rest of the country tuned in. There's a hard lesson in that for how we think about the whole thing. It's tempting to imagine the crisis as a discrete event, a storm that blew in and will eventually blow out. But in a place like Baltimore, it was never a storm. It was a climate, established over generations, shaped by decades of disinvestment and segregation and neglect, that concentrated the damage in specific neighborhoods and left it there to compound. The drug changed, the chemistry got deadlier, but the underlying geography of harm was drawn a very long time ago, by forces that had nothing to do with any pill or powder. So Maryland sits high on our board tonight, carrying a burden with roots older than most of the people currently dying from it. The supply modernized, turned faster and more fatal than anyone imagined possible. But the soil it fell on had been tilled generations back, and no recent decline, however welcome, can quickly undo a problem that took half a century to plant. The Baltimore line is old. That, more than anything, is why it holds. Here's one that genuinely surprises people, mostly because it isn't a state at all, and gets quietly dropped from half the rankings on a technicality. Washington, D.C., the seat of the entire national government, the place that writes the drug policy for everyone else, carries one of the very highest overdose death rates in the country, right up there with the hardest hit states. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. Really sit with it, because it's the kind of detail that reorganizes how you see the whole crisis. Somewhere in that city, in grand buildings with columns and flags, generations of officials have declared, funded, and repeatedly redeclared a war on drugs. They've written the laws, set the budgets, held the hearings, posed for the photographs, and the sidewalks surrounding those very buildings are among the deadliest square miles in America for the exact substances all that policy was aimed at. The command center of the nation's response to the crisis sits inside one of the sharpest edges of the crisis itself. If you set out to write that as fiction, an editor would tell you it was too on the nose. The reason DC gets left off so many lists is a boring technicality that quietly hides a loud tragedy. It's not a state, so a lot of state-by-state rankings simply exclude it, the way a spreadsheet drops a row that doesn't fit the format. And so a place with a death rate rivaling the worst states in the Union routinely vanishes from the conversation entirely, not because it's doing well, but because it doesn't fit the shape of the chart. It's an accident of categorization that erases one of the most striking data points on the entire map. The most policy-saturated patch of ground in the country is also, by the numbers, among the most devastated, and it keeps falling through a crack in the formatting. The crisis there also has a particular face that cuts against the dominant national story. Much of the American conversation, shaped by the images we've already discussed, imagines the crisis as young, white, rural, Appalachian. But the burden in DC has fallen heavily on older residents and on communities that the standard narrative tends to overlook completely. People who came up through earlier eras of the drug and are now facing the fentanyl age with bodies already worn and support systems already frayed. It's a reminder that the crisis wears many faces, and that the one the country pictures is only one of them, and not always the one dying fastest. There's something almost unbearably instructive about the geography of it. Proximity to power, it turns out, is not proximity to help. You can be within literal walking distance of the institutions that shape the entire national response, and still be in one of the least protected populations in the country. The resources, the attention, the sense of urgency that get lavished on the crisis in the abstract do not automatically radiate outward to the streets immediately outside the window. The view from the top of the policy machine, it seems, does not reliably include the sidewalk directly beneath it. This isn't really a story about hypocrisy, or at least not only that. It's a story about how a crisis can be simultaneously the subject of enormous official attention, and, in the very shadow of that attention, allowed to burn nearly unchecked. The gap between the policy and the pavement is where a great deal of this whole tragedy lives, and nowhere is that gap more visible or more grimly literal than in the capital. So DC earns a place high on our list tonight, on the merits and by the numbers, even as it keeps getting dropped from other people's charts on a formatting excuse. It's a small district with an enormous rate, sitting at the exact centre of the country's response to a problem it has not managed to solve on its own doorstep. The people who write the map, it turns out, live on one of its darkest points. They just keep leaving themselves off it. Now we reach one of the most undertold stories on the entire map, and one of the saddest. Long before Appalachia became the face of the crisis, long before anyone had heard the word fentanyl, New Mexico was already there, already grieving, already posting some of the highest overdose death rates in the nation, going all the way back to the 1990s. Think about what that head start actually means, because it reframes the whole national timeline. The story most Americans carry in their heads is that the overdose crisis began sometime in the 2000s with the pills and built from there into the catastrophe of recent years. And for much of the country that's roughly true. But New Mexico was living a version of this while the rest of the nation was still blissfully unaware there was anything to live through. When the country finally discovered the epidemic and reacted as though it were brand new, New Mexico had already been burying its people at devastating rates for a full generation. It didn't join the crisis. It was there waiting when the crisis arrived for everyone else. The centre of that long sorrow was in the state's northern reaches, in valleys of extraordinary beauty that also carried an extraordinary weight of loss. Certain small communities up there developed some of the highest overdose death rates, not just in the state, but in the entire country, sustained over years, passed down through families like a bitter inheritance. These weren't boom towns or industrial ruins. They were old, rooted, close-knit places, which makes the depth of the sorrow there feel even heavier, because everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone grieved everyone. And here is the detail that makes New Mexico's story land hardest against tonight's title. In the most recent numbers, while so much of the country was finally exhaling, watching its death rates fall in that historic decline we discussed, New Mexico was among the small handful of places moving the opposite way, climbing again. It is, in a painful sense, the state that got there first and cannot seem to leave, that pioneered this grief before the nation understood it, and is now, decades on, still caught in it while others begin to recover. The country spent years catching up to a sorrow New Mexico already knew, and now that the country is pulling ahead, New Mexico is being left behind in the very condition it once led the way into. There's a particular loneliness to being early to a tragedy. When New Mexico's rates were climbing in the 1990s, there was no national conversation to be part of, no wave of attention, no flood of resources aimed at a problem the country hadn't yet admitted it had. The grief happened in relative silence, off the national radar, in communities that were already among the poorest and most overlooked in America. By the time the spotlight finally swung toward the crisis, it swung toward newer, more photogenic epicenters, and the state that had been suffering longest slipped right back into the shadows it had never really left. That silence is part of why New Mexico's story is so undertold. It doesn't fit the timeline. It complicates the neat narrative of a crisis that began with the pills, because here was a place already devastated before the pills fully arrived, for reasons rooted in a much older and more local history. It's an inconvenient data point for anyone who wants a simple story with a single starting gun, and inconvenient data points have a way of getting quietly left out. So, New Mexico sits high on our list tonight, and sits there with a longer, deeper history behind its numbers than almost anywhere else we'll visit. It got to this grief first, before the country was watching, and it's still in it now as the country begins to move on. The sorrow there is quiet, ancestral, and stubborn. The head start nobody ever wanted, still running long after the rest of the field caught up and started to pull away. So why New Mexico, and why so early? The honest answer is a tangle, and tonight we'll untangle it gently, because this is the kind of history that gets flattened into a stereotype if you're not careful. Part of it is a very old heroin trade running up from the south, along routes that predate the modern crisis entirely. Part of it is geography, remote communities strung across enormous distances, far from hospitals, far from treatment, far from the everyday friction that catches a problem early. Start with those old roots, because they're the deepest layer. New Mexico sits along corridors that carried heroin north for many decades, long before the pills or the fentanyl, which means certain communities had access to a steady supply going back generations. This wasn't a place waiting for a new drug to be invented. It was a place with an established long-running trade, and where there's a long-running supply, there tends to be a long-running population of people caught in it. The pipeline was old, quiet and reliable, and it seeded a problem in the state well before the national one got going. Then layer geography on top, because geography here is destiny in a very literal sense. New Mexico is enormous and sparsely settled, with communities scattered across huge distances, some of them small, remote, and hours from anything resembling comprehensive medical care. When you're that far from a hospital, that far from a treatment centre, that far from the ordinary web of services that might catch a person early, a problem has room to grow deep before anyone with the tools to help ever encounters it. Isolation isn't just lonely, it's dangerous, because it removes all the friction that might otherwise slow a slide, the checkups, the interventions, the simple fact of being seen. And then, underneath all of it, the deepest and most painful layer, poverty and history. New Mexico has long been among the poorest states in the country, and its poverty is entangled with a history of dispossession, disruption, and generational trauma in communities that had every reason to hurt and precious few resources with which to heal. When a place has been ground down over a very long time, when the economic ground has been thin for generations, and the historical wounds run deep, the conditions for widespread addiction are simply present in a way they aren't in more prosperous, more stable places. The ache came first here, partly because the reasons to ache had accumulated here for so long. It's crucial to hold all three of these together, the old roots, the isolating geography, the deep poverty and trauma, and to resist the lazy temptation to collapse them into a single flattering or unflattering story. New Mexico's early sustained crisis was never about one drug or one bad decade or any failing of the people living there. It was about a specific place where several different kinds of isolation, economic, geographic, historical, all happened to point in the same direction at once, compounding one another into a sorrow that arrived early and stayed late. That convergence is why the state aches so distinctly, and why the ache proved so durable. Any one of these factors alone might have produced a manageable problem. All of them stacked together, in the same communities, over the same generations, produce something much harder. A crisis with roots in the soil rather than just in the supply. You can crack down on a drug. You can, with enormous effort, disrupt a root. But you cannot quickly undo generations of poverty and distance and historical harm. And until those change, the underlying vulnerability remains. So the land of enchantment ached first, and aches still, for reasons that are genuinely tragic and genuinely specific to this place. It got to the crisis early because the ingredients had been assembling there for a very long time, quietly, far from the national gaze. Understanding that is the difference between judging New Mexico and grieving with it, and grieving is by far the more honest response to a sorrow this old and this deep. New England likes to think of itself as the sensible corner of the country, all stone walls and universities and quiet good sense, which makes it genuinely startling how high some of these small states climb. Maine in particular sits far higher than its gentle lighthouse image would ever suggest. The Northeast crisis is a quieter one, less concentrated in a single dramatic neighbourhood, more scattered across rural towns and fading mill communities where the nearest treatment centre might be an hour of winding road away. There's a real cognitive dissonance to it, and the dissonance is instructive. When you picture Maine, you probably picture something out of a calendar: rocky coastline, lobster boats, red barns against autumn foliage, a kind of wholesome, weathered New England postcard. It is genuinely one of the most scenic corners of the country, and it also carries an overdose burden that would shock the people admiring those postcards, a crisis unfolding quietly inside the scenery in the small inland towns the tourists drive through without stopping. The gap between the image and the reality is enormous, and that gap is itself part of the story. The northeast version of the crisis is a rural, dispersed one, and that shapes everything about how it plays out. There's no single infamous neighbourhood here to become a national symbol, no avenue for the cameras. Instead, it's spread across a landscape of small towns and old mill communities, places that lost their industry decades ago and never fully replaced it, where the damage is thin, wide, and largely invisible. In a big city, a concentrated crisis at least gets noticed. In rural Maine, it happens in a farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road, or a small apartment above a shuttered storefront, out of sight of anyone who might raise an alarm. And the geography here does something cruel that we've seen elsewhere, but that hits especially hard in the rural northeast. It puts help impossibly far away. When the nearest treatment facility is an hour of winding, weather-beaten road distant, when the nearest hospital is a serious drive and the roads ice over for months, the practical distance between a struggling person and any real help becomes vast. Addiction thrives in that distance. It's a condition that responds to early, consistent, accessible care, and rural isolation removes all three of those, leaving people to struggle alone in beautiful empty places where nobody's close enough to notice they're drowning. Maine's high ranking does something valuable, though, which is that it detonates one of the most stubborn and comforting myths of this entire crisis, the myth that it's somebody else's regional problem. So many people carry a mental map where the epidemic lives in Appalachia, or in the inner city, or out on the distant frontier, safely somewhere else. Somewhere that isn't here. Maine says no. The crisis will settle just as readily into a picturesque New England village as into a Rust Belt ruin. It packs a bag and moves into the scenery. There is no corner of the country so wholesome, so scenic, so sensible that it's immune. That's the real lesson of the polite northeastern struggle. It reveals that the factors driving this thing, economic decline, isolation, despair, access to a lethal supply, aren't confined to any one type of place or any one image of American hardship. They can and do appear anywhere the conditions gather, including in the last place a tourist would ever suspect. The lighthouse and the lobster boat are real. So is the quiet crisis unfolding just inland from them, in towns that don't make the postcards. So Maine and its northeastern neighbours climb higher on this list than their gentle reputations would ever predict, carrying a dispersed, rural, largely invisible burden through some of the prettiest country in America. It's a struggle conducted politely, quietly, out of frame, in a region that likes to think of itself as too sensible for such things. The crisis, it turns out, does not check a region's self-image before moving in. It just needs an opening, and it found plenty, even here. Delaware is tiny, the kind of state you can drive across before your coffee gets cold, and yet it consistently punches catastrophically above its size on this list. It's a perfect illustration of why per capita ranking matters so much, and why small states dominate the ugly end of it. When a state has relatively few people, a concentrated crisis produces a per capita rate that dwarfs enormous states, losing far more people in raw terms. Let's use Delaware to really nail down the math we set up at the beginning, because it's the cleanest example on the whole board. Imagine two states. One is gigantic, with millions upon millions of residents, and it loses a large raw number of people to overdose, a headline-grabbing figure. The other is Delaware, small, with a fraction of the population, losing a much smaller raw number. On the raw count map, the giant state looks like the disaster and Delaware barely registers. But divide each state's losses by its population, and the picture flips violently. Delaware's smaller losses, spread across its much smaller population, produce a rate that towers over the giants. Same tragedy, wildly different rankings, entirely because of the denominator. This is exactly why the ugly end of our list is crowded with smaller states, rather than the famous big ones. It's not that small states are somehow more prone to addiction by nature. It's that in a small state, a concentrated crisis has nowhere to hide, nowhere to dilute itself. In a vast state, even a serious problem gets averaged out across an enormous population and softened into a moderate-looking rate. In a small one, the same intensity of crisis, or even less, produces a rate that looks apocalyptic because there's no vast healthy population to dilute it. Smallness concentrates the number the way a small room concentrates a smell. But Delaware isn't high just because of the denominator trick. It also sits in a genuinely dangerous spot, wedged directly into the dense interstate spine of the East Coast, right on the corridor running between major cities. That location means the strongest, freshest supply passes through it constantly. The same arteries that move so much legitimate commerce, also moving the deadliest products straight through this tiny state. It's small, it's dense, and it's directly downstream of everything, which is a terrible combination. It absorbs a crisis sized for a place many times larger, funneled through it by geography it can't do anything about. There's a real lesson in Delaware for anyone who assumes the worst hit places must be the biggest, the most notorious, the ones with famous troubled neighborhoods. Sometimes the most dangerous place to be statistically is simply small, in the wrong location, on the wrong road, with nowhere for the problem to disperse. Delaware doesn't have a nationally infamous epicenter. It doesn't need one. Its whole geography, small and dense and sitting astride a major supply route, does the work, producing a rate that lands it high on the list without any single dramatic image attached. It also quietly rebukes the way we instinctively rank tragedies by fame. We assume the states we've heard the most about must be the worst, when really the states we've heard about are just the ones with the most photogenic or infamous concentrations. A place like Delaware, with no viral neighborhood and no documentary crew, can be suffering at a higher per capita rate than a state that's become a household name for the crisis, simply because it never produced the single, striking image that draws the cameras. So Delaware earns its place high on our board tonight. The smallest state with some of the biggest numbers, a walking demonstration of why we measure rate instead of raw totals. It's proof that in this grim accounting, being small and poorly located can be far more dangerous than being large and famous. The state you can cross before your coffee cools carries a burden size for somewhere many times its size, quietly, without a single iconic image, near the very top of a list it never asked to climb. Now we enter Appalachia proper, the region so thoroughly identified with this crisis that its name has become almost a synonym for it. Tennessee and its neighbours along the mountain spine sit near the top of nearly every version of this list, and the reasons form a near-perfect storm. Start with the Pill Mill Highway we drove earlier, which dumped its cargo directly into these hills. Picture the setting, because the setting is doing an enormous amount of the work. Steep, folded mountains, narrow valleys called hollows tucked between the ridges, small communities strung along winding roads, isolated from one another and from the wider world by the terrain itself. For much of history, those mountains were a kind of protection, a natural barrier that kept the region apart, self-reliant, insulated. In the crisis, that same isolating geography became a trap, a landscape where help was far, escape was hard, and a problem once introduced had every condition it needed to sink deep roots and stay. Then bring in the economy, because Appalachia's economy is central to the whole tragedy. This is coal country, or was, a region built on hard, dangerous physical labour that used bodies up and left the making. Generations of miners and manual labourers carried genuine, chronic, legitimate pain, the kind that makes a prescription for powerful relief seem entirely reasonable. So when the pills arrived, they landed in a population with both a real medical need and, when the mines declined, a deep economic despair, an exact overlap of physical and existential pain that made the region uniquely vulnerable. The demand was real, rooted in worn-out bodies and worn-out prospects alike. Now add the pill mill highway, that pipeline we trace from the south, funneling prescription opioids straight up into these hills by the trunkload. And add something even darker, which later reckonings would lay bare. An industry that studied regions exactly like this one and targeted them, flooding communities with opioids in quantities that beg a belief. Small mountain towns receiving volumes of pills that no honest medical need could ever explain. Appalachia wasn't an accidental casualty. In important ways, it was a chosen market, identified for its vulnerability and saturated for profit, its real pain treated as a sales opportunity. Stack all of that together, the isolating geography, the pain-worn economy, the generational poverty, the pipeline of pills, the deliberate targeting, and you don't get a mystery. You get near-perfect storm, every ingredient of catastrophe present at once and reinforcing every other. That's why Tennessee and its neighbours along the mountain spine appear near the top of essentially every ranking year after year. It wasn't a fluke or a failing. It was the predictable result of aiming at many forces at one vulnerable region simultaneously. And it's worth being precise about the moral shape of this, because the easy story blames the mountains and the true story indicts what was done to them. The lazy narrative treats Appalachian addiction as a cultural failing, a stereotype about backward hill people making bad choices. The honest narrative is that these were communities with real bodily pain and real economic despair, who were then identified as a soft market and deliberately flooded with a product sold on false promises of safety. The people didn't go looking for this. It was engineered, marketed, and delivered to their doorsteps, with a signature required on arrival. So we enter the corridor through the mountains near the summit of our list, in a region whose very name has become shorthand for the crisis. The mountains that once kept these communities safe and separate became the walls of a trap nobody living there had built. The bodies that ached from honest labour became a market. The isolation that had long defined the region became the thing that let the damage sink deepest and linger longest. Appalachia sits high on this list not because it chose to, but because nearly every force in this entire story converged on it at once, and the mountains that had always protected it had no defence against a threat delivered by highway and prescription pad. Swing south to the Gulf Coast and Louisiana takes its place high on the board, carrying a burden shaped by its own particular history. This is a state that has spent the modern era absorbing shock after shock, catastrophic storms, chronic poverty, one of the weakest safety nets in the country, all of which form the exact conditions in which addiction thrives and treatment withers. To understand Louisiana, you have to understand the sheer accumulation of hardship the state has weathered, because addiction doesn't arise in a vacuum, it arises in the aftermath of things. Here is a place battered repeatedly by catastrophic storms, each one leaving behind not just physical wreckage but psychological wreckage, displacement, loss, trauma, the slow grinding stress of rebuilding again and again. Layer onto that some of the deepest and most persistent poverty in the nation, and a public safety net thinner than almost anywhere else. Fewer services, less treatment, less of the infrastructure that catches people before they fall too far. a landscape of accumulated wounds with very little in the way of bandages. Those are essentially the perfect conditions for a substance crisis to take hold and dig in. Trauma drives people toward anything that dulls the pain. Poverty removes the resources and stability that might otherwise buffer them. A weak safety net means that when someone does start to struggle, there's little to catch them. Few treatment beds, long waits, services stretched to breaking. Each of these alone is a risk factor. Together repeatedly, over years of storms and hardship, they compound into exactly the kind of environment where addiction flourishes and recovery struggles to get a foothold. Louisiana's high ranking is, in large part, the arithmetic of unaddressed hardship. There's genuinely good news to report here too, and it deserves real weight, because Louisiana was among the states that posted some of the largest declines in the most recent numbers, part of that historic national drop. That's not nothing. That represents real people still alive who would not have been, real families spared a phone call in the night. But it's important to be honest about the starting point because Louisiana climbed onto this list from a very high place. A large decline from a very high number can still leave you high on the board. Progress and severity aren't opposites. You can be improving faster than almost anyone and still be among the hardest hit, and Louisiana is both at once. The Gulf story serves as a useful correction to a bias that runs through much of the national conversation, the quiet assumption that this is fundamentally a cold weather crisis, a rust belt and mountain and frozen frontier phenomenon. Louisiana, warm and coastal and southern, says otherwise. The crisis doesn't follow the climate, it follows hardship. It settles wherever the ground has already been softened by loss, wherever trauma has accumulated and resources have thinned, and few states have had their ground softened as thoroughly, as repeatedly as this one. Sunshine offers no immunity. Grief is the actual climate the crisis responds to, and grief has no preferred temperature. That reframing matters, because if you believe the crisis is about cold and Appalachia and the frozen north, you'll look for it in the wrong places and miss it entirely in the warm ones. Louisiana forces a more accurate model. This is a disease of accumulated hardship, of trauma layered on poverty, layered on thin support, and those conditions can gather just as easily under a hot Gulf sky as under a grey northern one. The map of the crisis is really a map of where life has been hardest, and hardship, unlike snow, falls everywhere. So Louisiana sits high on our list tonight, near the top, carrying the weight of storms and poverty and a threadbare safety net, even as it makes some of the fastest progress in the country. It's a monument to how the crisis follows grief rather than geography, how it takes root wherever the ground has been broken often enough. Warm weather couldn't protect it. Repeated catastrophe made it fertile, and the recent improvement, real and welcome as it is a descent from a peak that towered very high indeed. We have to stop the car here, at the top of the list, and name the single force that rewrote the entire map: fentanyl. Understand that almost everything we've ranked tonight can be split into before and after this one substance arrived at scale, somewhere in the middle of the last decade. Before fentanyl, overdose was largely a story of pills and heroin, dangerous but comparatively slow, a crisis measured in a rising line. To grasp what fentanyl did, you have to understand how staggeringly potent it is compared to what came before. This is a synthetic opioid so powerful that a lethal dose is nearly invisible, a quantity you could lose in the creases of your palm. That potency changes the entire physics of the crisis. With older drugs, there was at least some rough, terrible predictability, some relationship between the amount and the effect that a long-term user learned to navigate, however dangerously. Fentanyl demolished that. When the active dose and the fatal dose are separated by a margin smaller than the human eye can reliably measure, every single use becomes a coin flip, and the coin is weighted badly. It's also cheap to produce and easy to move, which is precisely why it took over the supply. From a purely economic standpoint, from the cold logic of the market, fentanyl is enormously efficient, vastly more potent per unit, cheaper to manufacture, easier to smuggle in tiny concentrated quantities. So it didn't just appear as one more option on the menu. It infiltrated everything, mixed into other drugs, pressed into counterfeit pills, showing up where buyers didn't know to expect it and couldn't possibly measure it. People died not only because they sought it out, but because it had quietly colonized a supply they thought they understood. That word, everything, is the key to the turn. Before fentanyl, if you were using a particular drug, you had at least a rough sense of what you were taking. After fentanyl, that certainty evaporated across the entire illicit supply, because the invisible, lethal additive could be in the pill, in the powder, in the thing that used to be relatively survivable. It turned a chronic, grinding, slow-rising crisis into an acute, explosive one, where the line on the graph didn't just climb but went nearly vertical. The states at the top of our list tonight are, more than anything else, the states fentanyl reached first, hardest, and most thoroughly. And here's the piece that connects back to that surprising decline we discussed at the start, because fentanyl's arrival explains the climb, and its behaviour may partly explain the fall. The recent sudden drop in deaths, that historic reversal nobody celebrated, coincides with shifts in the fentanyl supply itself, and with the frantic public health response built specifically to counter it. The antidote sprays flooding communities, the treatment expansions, the harm reduction aimed squarely at this one lethal molecule. Fentanyl drove the numbers to their terrible peak, and the fight against fentanyl, along with changes in the supply, is a big part of why they've lately come down. The whole modern shape of the crisis, up and then down, is largely the shadow of this single substance. It's genuinely hard to overstate how completely this one drug redrew the map. Every ranking, every regional pattern, every story we've told tonight has fentanyl running underneath it. The force that took existing vulnerabilities in Appalachia, in Baltimore, in the boomtowns in New Mexico, and made all of them exponentially more lethal at roughly the same moment. It didn't create the vulnerabilities. Those were built over decades by economics and geography and history. But it weaponized them, converting long-standing struggles into sudden mass death with brutal efficiency. So we pause at the fentanyl turn before crowning anyone, because without it none of the top of this list makes sense. It's the hinge the whole modern crisis swings on, the thing that separates the slow-rising past from the vertical present, and the thing whose recent retreat is the largest and least explained mercy in the entire story. Understand fentanyl, and you understand why the summit of this list looks the way it does, and why, against all expectation, it has lately begun, just slightly, to descend. Back to the Ohio Valley one final time, because it refuses to leave the upper tier no matter how many years pass. This broad region, straddling several states along the Great River, became a kind of permanent epicenter, the place where every wave of the crisis, pills, then heroin, then fentanyl, then the tranq, landed in sequence without the previous wave ever fully receding. That word sequence is the whole tragedy of the valley, so let's trace it, because it's a masterclass in how a crisis compounds. First came the pills, flooding the industrial towns and river communities, seeding a broad dependence in a population already hollowed by economic decline. Before that wave had crested, before the region could even begin to recover, the pills got harder to get and heroin rushed in to meet the demand they'd created, a second wave breaking over communities still reeling from the first. Then, before heroin's damage could settle, fentanyl arrived and made everything vastly deadlier. A third wave, taller and more lethal than either before it. And then the tranq, the sedative additive, a fourth complication layered on top of all the rest. Wave after wave, each arriving before the last had passed. This is addiction not as an event but as a geology, layer upon layer, each new stratum laid down on top of the one before without any of them eroding away. In a place that gets hit once and then recovers, the crisis has a shape, a peak, and a decline, a story with an arc. In the Ohio Valley, there was never a decline long enough to matter before the next wave hit. The layers just kept accumulating, each generation inheriting a slightly deadlier version of what the last one faced. The pill-era parents giving way to fentanyl-era kids, the whole thing deepening rather than resolving. That relentless stacking is precisely why the Valley won't let go of the top tier of this list. Most places can point to a bad period. The Ohio Valley has had a bad era, sustained across the entire modern span of the crisis, with no single moment where it could catch its breath. Recovery here was never a matter of surviving one storm and rebuilding in the calm afterward. It was a matter of surviving a permanently altered climate, where the storms simply kept coming, each one finding a population already exhausted by the last. There was no afterward long enough to rebuild in. The recent national decline has, mercifully, finally reached even these valley communities, and several of the states along the river have posted real improvements, the first genuine easing in a very long time. That deserves to be honoured. But the region's long unbroken tenure near the summit of these lists should teach a hard humility about what recovery actually requires. When a place has spent this long absorbing wave after wave, one good year of falling numbers, however welcome, doesn't undo an era of compounding damage. The layers are still there in the shortened lives, the fractured families, the communities that have buried too many for too long. There's a broader lesson the Valley offers about how we think about this whole crisis. It's tempting to imagine addiction as an outbreak, something that flares and then, with the right response, subsides. The Ohio Valley suggests a different and darker model for the hardest hit places. Not an outbreak, but a chronic condition, something woven into the region's water and work and long waiting, that flares and fades but never quite resolves, always ready to worsen with the next wave. Treating a chronic condition like an acute one, expecting a clean recovery, sets everyone up for disappointment and for cutting the response short right when it's finally starting to work. So we visit the Ohio Valley one last time near the top of our list, a region that refuses to release its grip on the summit because the crisis there never released its grip on the region. Wave after wave, layer upon layer, generation after generation, it absorbed everything this epidemic could throw and kept absorbing before it could ever heal. The numbers are finally bending down, and that's real. But the Valley won't let go easily, because a crisis this deeply layered doesn't lift like weather. It lingers like sediment, settled into the bones of the place. Kentucky lives permanently in the top handful, and yet it rarely gets the singular spotlight thrown on its more famous neighbour. It's the overlooked heavyweight of this crisis, checking nearly every box we've built tonight. Appalachian geography, a coal economy that broke a lot of bodies before it broke down entirely, deep rural poverty, isolation from care, and a front row seat to the pill mill era. Run through the checklist because Kentucky's presence near the summit is almost overdetermined. So many separate causes all pointing the same way. It shares the folded, isolating Appalachian terrain we walk through with Tennessee, the hollows and winding roads that keep help far and problems hidden. It shares the coal history, an economy built on brutal physical labour that wore bodies down and generated genuine chronic pain across whole communities and then collapsed, adding economic despair on top of physical ache. It shares the deep rural poverty, the isolation from treatment, and it sat squarely in the path of the pill mill pipeline that flooded the region with opioids. Every ingredient of catastrophe we've identified tonight is present in Kentucky at once. By any fair accounting, this is one of the most devastated places in the entire country, and has been for years. In almost any other company, with almost any other set of neighbours, Kentucky's numbers would make it the headline. The state whose name became shorthand for the whole crisis, the one with the documentaries and the national attention. Its per capita losses have been staggering and sustained. It is, on the merits, a top-tier tragedy by every measure we've been using. And yet it's overlooked, and the reason why is quietly revealing. It's not that Kentucky's doing better than its reputation suggests. It's that it happens to sit beside one or two even more famous, even harder hit states, and in the shadow of those household names, Kentucky's own devastation gets treated as a supporting detail rather than a headline. The national imagination has room for only so many faces of the crisis, and Kentucky, despite ranking near the very top, keeps getting edged out of that limited frame by neighbours whose stories caught the spotlight first. There's something genuinely telling in that, about how attention gets distributed in this whole tragedy. Being among the most devastated places in America is apparently not enough to guarantee you're seen. You also need the right combination of a striking image, a memorable statistic, a story that fits the narrative the country has already decided to tell. Kentucky has the suffering in full measure. It just never produced the single iconic moment that draws the cameras, and so it endures near the summit of this grim list largely unremarked, a heavyweight fighting in the undercard. That invisibility has real consequences beyond hurt feelings. Attention brings resources, brings urgency, brings the sustained national will to actually address a problem. The places that become the famous faces of the crisis, for all the indignity of being a symbol, at least get looked at, funded, prioritised. The overlooked heavyweights like Kentucky risk being left to carry a top-tier burden with a fraction of the top-tier attention, precisely because they never became a name the whole country recognises. Being seen isn't just about vanity, it's about whether help ever arrives. So Kentucky earns its place near the very top of our list tonight, checking nearly every box we've built, one of the most devastated states in America, and one of the least singularly spotlighted. It's a reminder that behind every famous face of this crisis there's usually a second face, just as scarred, that never got the close-up. Kentucky simply endured, unfilmed and unranked in the popular imagination, near the summit of a list it never asked to climb, overlooked not because it suffered less, but because it happened to suffer next door to somewhere the cameras pointed first. Before we crown anyone, we owe California a proper explanation, because by one honest measure it is absolutely number one, and by our measure it isn't close. California loses more human beings to overdose than any other state, period, a raw toll that runs to the tens of thousands. If this were a list of total deaths, the countdown would end right here, tonight, in the biggest state in the Union. So let's give California its due, because the raw number is genuinely staggering, and it would be a disservice to wave it away. In a single recent year, California lost something on the order of 10,000 people to overdose. 10,000. That's an entire town's worth of human beings gone in 12 months in one state. By the raw count, no other state comes close, and every one of those deaths is a full human tragedy. A person with a life and people who loved them, no less real for being part of a large number. If our whole project tonight were to find the state where the most people die, we would have found it, and we could all go to bed. But spread that staggering figure across nearly 40 million residents, and the per capita rate settles into the moderate middle of the pack, nowhere near the top. This is the whole statistical engine of the countdown, laid bare in one example. California has so many people that even an enormous raw toll, divided by that vast population, produces a rate that looks almost unremarkable, sitting comfortably in the middle tiers rather than near the summit. The same 10,000 deaths that dominate the raw count map become, on the per capita map, a middling shade of orange, because there are simply so many Californians to divide the grief among. This is the great statistical trick at the heart of every ranking like ours, and the crucial thing is that it cuts both ways and that both results are completely true. It's why California will always headline the raw numbers stories, the ones designed to shock, and will never top the per capita rankings, the ones designed to measure intensity. Neither is a lie. The largest single pile of overdose grief in the entire country genuinely sits in California. And a per capita rate that looks almost calm beside the states at the top of our list also genuinely sits in California. Both facts describe the same state in the same year, and they refuse to be reconciled into a single number, because they're answering two different questions. The temptation, always, is to pick whichever number supports the point you already wanted to make, and you'll see people do exactly that constantly. Someone arguing that California is a disaster will quote the raw 10,000. Someone arguing it's doing fine will quote the moderate rate. Both are technically citing real data, and both are quietly hiding the other half of the truth. The honest position is the uncomfortable one. California is simultaneously the site of the most overdose death in America and a state with a middling overdose rate, and holding both at once is the only accurate way to see it. That's why California gets an asterisk rather than a ranking tonight. It doesn't fit cleanly into a per capita countdown, because its whole story is about the gap between raw totals and rates, the gap we've been navigating all night. To slot it into a specific rank would be to pretend that gap doesn't exist, to flatten the most instructive example we have of why the measurement choice matters so much. California isn't near the top of our list, and that's correct by our method, and it's also the place where more people die than anywhere else, and that's correct by another. The asterisk holds both, so we tip our hat to California and move on, carrying its lesson with us into the final stretch. The biggest pile of grief in the country sits there, and so does a rate that looks almost gentle, and both are true, and they don't cancel out. They just sit side by side, refusing to fit on the same map, a permanent reminder that in this whole grim accounting, the number you choose determines the story you tell. Now, at last, to the actual summit. And so we arrive, at last, at the state that has worn this bitter crown longer and more consistently than any other, West Virginia. For years, through wave after wave, no state in the country lost its people to overdose faster per capita. The rate here reached heights that are genuinely hard to comprehend. Figures approaching 40 for every 100,000 residents and beyond, numbers that would look like typos anywhere else. Let that rate sink in by comparison, because the number only means something next to the others. Remember the low end of our list, the plain states down around 3 or 4 per 100,000. West Virginia, at its worst, was pushing 10 times that, a per capita death rate so far above the gentle end of the map that they hardly seem to belong to the same country. If you'd shown that figure to a public health official from an earlier, calmer era, they'd have assumed a decimal point had wandered off. It's the kind of number that stops looking like a statistic and starts looking like a wound. For a very long stretch, this made West Virginia the undisputed answer to the question this whole video asks. If you gathered a room full of strangers and asked them to name the most drug-addicted state, most of them would say West Virginia. And for years they'd have been exactly, tragically right. It became the shorthand, the mental image, the place the whole country pictured when it thought about the crisis at its worst. The state's name and the epidemic's face fused together in the national imagination, a fusion earned by a rate that genuinely led the nation, year after brutal year. But here is the turn that makes tonight's title honest. the twist that keeps West Virginia from being the boring, obvious answer to a you-won't-guess number one setup. West Virginia has recently posted one of the steepest declines in the entire country, its overdose death rate falling by something close to half in a remarkably short window. The longtime champion of this list is suddenly and dramatically coming down off its terrible peak faster than almost anywhere else. The reign that seemed permanent, that defined the crisis for a decade, is showing real signs of finally ending. That decline is worth pausing on, because it's genuinely extraordinary and genuinely fragile at once. A drop of nearly half in a short span represents an enormous number of West Virginians still alive who, by the trajectory of just a few years ago, would not have been. It's one of the brightest data points in the entire national story, evidence that even the hardest hit place in the country, the one everyone had written off as hopelessly lost to this, could turn a corner this sharply. Whatever combination of causes produced it, the overdose antidote everywhere, treatment expansion, shifts in the supply, changes among the most vulnerable. The result is real and remarkable. And yet it would be a mistake to declare victory, because a steep decline from a staggeringly high peak can still leave you very high. Even after cutting its rate nearly in half, West Virginia remains near the top of the board, because it started from such an extreme height that even dramatic improvement doesn't drop it out of the summit here. It's simultaneously the biggest success story on the list and still one of the most devastated states, both the falling champion and for now still very near the throne. Progress and severity coexist here just as they did in Louisiana, just more starkly. So West Virginia's long reign appears to be ending, and that ending is one of the most hopeful things in this entire grim survey. The state that defined the crisis is now, in a sense, helping define the recovery, falling faster than nearly anyone. But it hasn't fallen off the board, not yet, and its recent welcome decline raises exactly the question this whole countdown has been building toward. If the old king is finally coming down off the mountain, if the state that owned the top spot for so long is loosening its grip, then someone, somewhere, is rising to take its place. And the answer to who is genuinely not what most people would ever guess. Before we answer that, West Virginia deserves the honest story of how it ever got there, because the lazy version is cruel, and the true version is damning to almost everyone except the people who suffered it. This is a state built on coal, which means a workforce with genuinely broken bodies and a legitimate constant need for pain relief. Begin with the coal, because everything grows from it. For generations, West Virginia's economy and identity were bound up in mining, some of the hardest and most dangerous physical labour there is. That work built the state, and it also broke the bodies of the people who did it, decade after decade, producing a population with an unusually high burden of genuine, chronic, disabling pain. Ruined backs, wrecked joints, the accumulated wear of a life spent underground doing brutal physical work. So when we talk about a legitimate need for pain relief here, we mean it literally. This was a place full of people who genuinely, medically hurt, through no fault of their own, as a direct consequence of the labour that sustained the entire state. Into that landscape of real, widespread pain marched an industry that saw the ache not as a tragedy to be treated carefully, but as a market to be exploited aggressively. As later reckonings and investigations would lay bare, West Virginia was flooded with prescription opioids in quantities that defy belief, volumes so absurd that some tiny towns received millions upon millions of pills, more doses than the entire local population could plausibly consume in many lifetimes. This wasn't medicine meeting need in careful proportion. It was saturation, a fire hose of powerful, addictive product, aimed at a small, vulnerable population, sold on assurances of safety that would prove to be worth nothing at all. Layer that deliberate flooding on top of everything else the state was already carrying, and the picture becomes overwhelming. The deepest poverty, the steepest isolation, mountain communities far from care and far from opportunity alike. An economy that, as coal declined, offered less and less hope, adding a crushing existential despair to the physical pain. You take a population with genuinely broken bodies and genuinely broken prospects, and you saturate it with an addictive product marketed as safe, and you do not get a story about weak-willed people making bad choices. You get a story about the predictable, engineered destruction of a vulnerable place. That distinction is the entire moral heart of West Virginia's story, and it's why the lazy version is so cruel. The lazy version looks at the highest addiction rate in the country and concludes something ugly about the character of the people who live there, some failing of will or virtue. The honest version looks at the same rate and sees a population that was identified precisely because it was vulnerable, targeted precisely because its pain made it a reliable market, and saturated for profit by people operating at a safe distance from the wreckage they were creating. The people of West Virginia didn't earn the top of this list. They were delivered there by the truckload, with a signature required on arrival. And once that dependence was seeded across an entire state, the rest followed the grim logic we've traced all night. When the pills eventually became harder to get, the need they'd manufactured didn't vanish. It went looking for cheaper, stronger, deadlier substitutes, first one and then the next, until fentanyl arrived and turned a widespread dependence into mass death. The pill flood laid the foundation. The later drugs built the catastrophe on top of it. But the foundation was poured deliberately by an industry that knew exactly what it was doing to exactly the kind of place least able to resist. So this is why West Virginia, the honest version, not because of any failing in its people, but because of what was done to a population of aching bodies and fading hope by those who saw all that suffering as an opportunity. It's the clearest, starkest example in the whole crisis of vulnerability being weaponized for profit. The state's recent decline is genuine cause for hope, but the reason it ever held the crown so long isn't a mystery, and it isn't the people's shame. It's a debt owed to them by everyone who profited from their pain. So here we are, at the end of the long quiet road, the rental car parked, the clipboard tossed onto the passenger seat, its columns of numbers finally still. We drove the whole strange length of it tonight, didn't we? From the wind-scoured plains where the poison arrived late and thin, up through the fading mill towns and the folded mountains, along the Pill Mill Highway and the Baltimore line, out to the sun-baked boom towns and the dark, distant reaches of the frontier. We counted a country's grief, state by state, and tried to do it gently, and now the engine is off, and the map is folded, and there's nothing left to tally. Just the quiet, and you, wherever you're lying, letting your eyes go soft in the dark. Think back over the ground we covered, because it's a lot to have carried in one sitting. We learned that nobody can quite count addiction, that we measure it mostly by counting the dead, that the two maps of America refuse to agree, one rewarding bigness and one revealing intensity. We learned that the crisis was rarely an accident of character, and almost always a convergence of forces, economic collapse and geographic isolation, and generational poverty, all pointed at the same vulnerable places at the same unlucky moments. We learned that some states inherited this sorrow generations deep, that others got it delivered by the truckload with a signature required on arrival, that the supply itself keeps mutating faster than anyone can build a defense. And we learned, at the very end, the thing that surprised even us, that the number one nobody guesses is a place we picture as empty, and that emptiness itself was the danger all along. It would be easy to close on despair, and for years that would have been the only honest ending. A crisis that climbed and climbed, that took an entire mid-sized city's worth of people every single year, that turned whole regions into permanent epicenters where the waves never stopped coming. If we'd made this journey a few years ago, we'd have parked the car here with nothing to offer you but the weight of it, and a quiet suggestion to hold your loved ones a little closer. But something shifted while almost nobody was watching. The numbers began to fall. Fast, actually. Faster than anyone predicted or dared to hope. Tens of thousands of people who were statistically slated to vanish did not vanish, and instead are out there right now, ordinary and alive, arguing about the thermostat, forgetting to text back, doing all the small unremarkable things the living get to do. Nobody threw them a parade, but they're here. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your bed, in a home with a door that locks and heat that comes from a dial and a phone within reach if anything ever went wrong, spare a soft thought for the people behind every number we recited. Not as statistics, not as ranks or rates or shades of red on a map, but as people. Each one as vivid to themselves as you are to yourself right now. The miner in the mountains whose body ached from honest work before anyone handed him a bottle of something that promised to help. The kid in the boomtown who moved 1,000 miles for a fresh start and found the same self waiting, only lonelier. The grandmother in the capital, blocks from the buildings where the policy was written, who came up through an earlier era of this and faced the newest one with a worn body and a frayed net. They were somebody's whole world. They mattered exactly as much as anyone you have ever loved. And spare a thought too for the ones who carried the weight without ever appearing on any list. The pharmacist who learned every regular's name and dreaded the day one of them stopped coming in. The overnight nurse who could predict the bad nights by the weather and the calendar. The harm reduction worker who became a wound care specialist overnight because the chemistry changed and someone had to. The parent who buried a child and got up the next morning anyway, and the next, and the next. Because that is what people do, stubbornly, hopelessly, heroically, when there is nothing else left to do. This crisis was never only the people it took. It was also all the people who stayed and held on and kept showing up in the dark to poke the embers back to life. That, if anything, is the resilience worth honouring tonight. Not the suffering, but the refusal to stop reaching for one another in the middle of it. Because that's the quiet thread running underneath every grim number we counted. Everywhere the crisis went, so did the ones trying to pull people back from it. Every gas station that started stocking the little rescue spray. Every treatment door that opened a fraction wider. Every community that decided its neighbours were worth saving even when saving them was hard and thankless and slow. The falling numbers didn't fall by accident. They fell because an enormous, mostly invisible army of ordinary people kept deciding, over and over, that a struggling person is still a person, still worth the trouble, still someone's whole world. The map bent toward mercy because a great many hands, most of whose names we'll never know, kept pushing it there. And remember the most hopeful thing the whole countdown had to teach, the thing hidden inside all that shifting and reshuffling. The crown moves. The most drug-addicted state is not a permanent title carved into some doomed place forever. West Virginia, the decade-long champion, is climbing down off the mountain faster than almost anyone. States that looked lost have turned corners nobody thought they could turn. A position that can be handed away is a position no place has to keep, which means this was never destiny. It was circumstance, and circumstance can change, and lately quietly against every expectation, it has been changing for the better. The story you heard tonight is real, but it is not finished, and its most recent chapters have been kinder than the ones before. So let the numbers go now. You don't have to hold them anymore. There's no quiz in the morning, no ranking to memorise, no map to keep folded in your head. Let the states blur back together into the one country they always were, the wide, strange, beautiful, hard place where people struggle and people help, and people, more of them than we dared to hope, survive. Let the clipboard stay on the passenger seat where you tossed it. The counting is done. You did the hard part, which was caring enough to listen all the way to the end of a story most people would rather not hear at all. And as you drift, hold on to the small, warm truth we ended on. Behind every falling rate are real people still here, still walking around under the same sky, who by the old trajectory would not have been. The same cold arithmetic that turned people into shadows also means, when the shadows thin, that people are living. The map is alive. It keeps rearranging itself while nobody watches, and lately it has been rearranging toward hope. That is not nothing. In a story this heavy, it might be everything. So rest now. Let your breathing slow and your shoulders drop, and the day's weight slide off into the mattress beneath you. Somewhere out there, in a mountain hollow, or a boomtown apartment, or a village at the frozen edge of the country, someone who might not have made it is making it, tonight, quietly, unremarkably, gloriously alive. You don't know their name and they don't know yours, but you're breathing under the same darkness, and both of you get to wake up tomorrow. That's the whole fragile miracle of it, and it's enough to carry you gently down into sleep. Good night. Be kind to the people around you, and just as kind to yourself. The map will keep bending while you rest, and with any luck, it'll keep bending the right way. Sleep well.